Thank you, Ben. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Frankie Jackson. I am the Dakota Cultural Resource Manager for the Lower Phalen Creek Project. And thank you for joining us for session 2 in our series of Reimagining Indian Mounds Park. Last session focused on archaeological truths and myths about Indian mounds. And part of those myths during our research led us down the road of researching where remains and funerary objects from the mounds ended. And to that end, during our research, much of the documentation that's out there will tell us that the remains that came out of the mound have all been repatriated. And that's simply not the case. And so our discussion is to talk about repatriation and what that might look like for our relatives that came from Indian Mounds Park. And so tonight, we have 4 guest speakers who will be joining us. We have Honor Keeler, who is a member of the Cherokee Nation and leads up the International Repatriation Coalition. We have Kade Ferris, who is the archaeologist for Red Lake Nation. We have Jaime Arsenault, who is the THPO and NAGPRA representative for White Earth. And we have Sam Odegard here, who will be joining us in person, and she's the THPO and NAGPRA representative for the Upper Sioux community. And what we ask our colleagues to do is share with you guys what repatriation looks like through a tribal lens. There's a lot of repatriation work that takes place here in Minnesota. And so I've asked our friends to share their experience with you, and then we'll lead you in a discussion after this, a discussion that will be led by our elders, J.B. Weston and Mr. Dave Lewis from Flandreau, gentlemen I've worked with in the field of repatriation for well over 20 years. And so with that, I'd like to thank our partners here at Metro State for creating a safe space for us to have this discussion. Talking about repatriation and the return of our ancestors and sacred objects will stir emotions, and I appreciate Metro State creating this safe space for us to have this discussion tonight. I would also like to take this time to thank our staff at Lower Phalen Creek. We're growing, and with that growth comes a lot of young energy and enthusiasm from our new employees. And so for all of those who helped make this event, put this event together, I say thank you. I'd like to take this time to thank our director, executive director, Maggie Lorenz, for believing in this work and for having the vision to pull us all together to have this discussion here tonight. And with that, our first speaker, I'm going to check our technical hookups here. We got the thumbs up from back there. All right. So with that, I want to bring Honor Keeler on first. Honor Keeler is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and a legal scholar working in Indigenous human rights, international repatriation, and Indigenous women's rights. I worked with Honor Keeler years ago for the National Trust for Historic Preservation when we were developing tribal initiatives for that organization. And she introduced me to the world of international repatriation over 18 years ago when I sat with her on the board for the International Repatriation Coalition. And you fast forward 18 years, that coalition has grown and it's morphed into some wonderful branches that's allowing various nations to bring items home from across the ocean. So with that, I'm going to welcome Honor and allow her to say a few opening comments before we get started.
OCO, can everyone hear me all right? Yes. Well, it's good to see you all here tonight. I'm sorry I can't be with you. As Frankie said, my name's Honor Keeler. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And I'm glad to be here with you tonight, and I'd like to thank the organizers and Frankie Jackson for putting this together. This is an important project. I think in our ongoing efforts for land back and for protecting ancestors and cultural items across our homelands. Frankie asked me to share a bit about who I am and what I do. And as he said before, we began working together many, many years ago. And that was a time when I think things were more difficult in these efforts to bring these spaces back to our people and to protect them. We both grew up, I know, surrounded by a lot of the older folks who worked in getting repatriation laws, the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, and the NMAI Act, and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed. And they broke the ceiling on repatriation in a time when there were many people in this country who were not willing to allow us to have our ancestors back home. They treated them like property. And we were surrounded by that momentum and that dedication and knowledge and wisdom, and I think eventually learned from it. And today's youth are an ongoing inspiration, I think, in particular to me, for their dedication, their presence, their strength, and their efforts to go to our sacred places and protect them. And these movements that have begun many years ago, maybe by different names, to occur and have come to this point in time as the Land Back movement, rematriation, and food sovereignty. These are things that are happening today in the park that you are all trying to protect and ensure becomes a cemetery for your people. But our work is never done, and that legacy we have today as protectors, the efforts here today are to change this designation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about repatriation. Many folks ask, what is repatriation? And I think folks have different definitions for it, but in general, under NAGPRA, or the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, a mechanism was created under US law to repatriate Native Americans and cultural items from federally funded institutions. And a lot of the work I do, though, often falls outside of NAGPRA, and in particular, international repatriation. I did sit for about 4 years on the Native American Grace Protection Repatriation Review Committee. And of course, the functions of that committee are to hear a lot of communities who come and ask for advice with regard to the repatriations that they're seeking. But internationally, higher estimates of our ancestors and cultural items held by museums and auction houses and international universities and private collections, maybe as many as 1 million indigenous ancestors and cultural items. This occurred through museum exchanges, sales, post-dating horrific things that happen to our communities. And many ancestors and cultural items, as we know, have been stolen from mounds up and down the Mississippi and Minnesota River Valley. So today, in addition to the traditional and codified indigenous laws that require us, where we have a duty to protect our ancestors and cultural items and sacred spaces, and bring our people home. International law has these frameworks that exist, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to support international repatriations. However, laws like NAGPRA in the United States do not yet exist in most other countries. And so we rely on specific institutions and collectors to contact us, for us to contact them and bring them home. But compared to a decade ago, many countries and museums are beginning to look into their own legacies and decolonize and seek international repatriation, so things are getting better. One of in addition to international repatriation, another thing I wanted to discuss here tonight is sacred places protection. It's hard work. My own work in sacred lands protection goes back a few decades, but my latest has been out at Bears Ears, and it involved efforts with the community that were often dangerous because the surrounding community was not supportive. And in particular, there was one character who was unhappy about a large ARPA investigation that had gone on. It's been one of the largest in history that ended up with 23 arrests there. And this individual retaliated on his birthday and drove his ATV with a number of other people through cultural resources sites, and was eventually convicted of trespassing and later became a state representative and was pardoned by President Trump. And one of the reasons I mention this is, although I think historically, a lot of our relatives, a lot of the people who taught us went through difficult times. We're beginning to see retaliation in some of our own spaces. And it's important that our community members stay safe in those instances. But I think with people pulling together as community, a lot can change. Building awareness ended up changing and protecting Bears Ears. And that support came from all over. It came from not only the tribes, but a lot of allies and other Native communities, and in particular, our Native members, tribal members, who were often working in cities and in different locations and could help spread that word and really come together in massive numbers to offer support. So I won't speak for too long tonight, but I just wanted to acknowledge the inspiration that this community has driven forward to hopefully make this park again a Dakota, a tribal place, and to protect the ancestors. And I thank you for that legacy. Widow, Frankie, I know we have a number of other speakers, and it's good to meet you and see you all here tonight.
Thank you very much, Honor. And if we can put the quick PowerPoint slides up. Our next speaker is Mr. Kade Ferris. He's an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. He is the tribal archaeologist and historic preservation officer for the Red Lake Nation. He has served in this capacity since 2014, and during his tenure, Kade has developed many new innovations for cultural resource management for the Red Lake Nation, including a regional GIS database for historical trail systems, village sites, procurement areas, and cultural resource sites. Kade holds a BA in anthropology from the University of North Dakota and a Master's of Science in anthropology from North Dakota State University. He is a registered professional archaeologist, meeting the Secretary of Interior's qualification standards in archaeology and history. With over 30 years of experience in the field, Kade has assisted over a dozen tribes in starting their own tribal historic preservation programs, enjoying mentoring others and improving their capacity for cultural resource management. Kade's most notable success in NAGPRA was the repatriation of a unique Medewin water drum, which was over 400 years old. And so with that, I welcome Kade to this discussion.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm glad to be here and talk about some of this stuff. This is, very important information to know, and it's almost a thankless job. I know we did have the PowerPoint. Just wanted to go over a couple of quick slides just to orient things. Well, first of all, NAGPRA, it's fairly simple. Since 1990, federal laws provided for the repatriation and disposition of certain Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. That's pretty much verbatim from the law. NAGPRA, when it was created, was to recognize that human remains must be treated with dignity and respect, and that human remains and other cultural items removed from federal or tribal lands belong to lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations. And of course, the law mandates that certain museums and federal agencies inventory their collections for remains and items that should be made available to tribes and descendants to participate or repatriate. One of the things that early on, my biggest complaint with NAGPRA is they have their annual grant program, which is supposed to help tribes visit collections to look for their own cultural goods and funerary objects and human remains. But back about 20 years ago, back in the old days, I guess we're talking around 2001. One thing that I noticed was a lot of the NAGPRA grants were going to museums, not to tribes. They were going to help these museums inventory their collections, which is something that they need to do, but it was very much focused originally, I thought, with trying to assist museums and not to assist tribes. And so we spent about a year. Every time that the NAGPRA Review Committee would have a meeting, we would go to the Review Committee meeting, no matter where it was in the United States, and we advocated that they change their focus, because museums need to be able to comply with NAGPRA as a law, but we really felt that they needed to start allocating those dollars to helping tribal efforts to visit these collections. And we did that until they started to finally listen. And I think that much more recently now, we're seeing a lot more tribes being provided funding and support that they need. And I think that's a really, really, really good thing. Let's go to the next slide, Frank. Now, the Minnesota statute 307.08, the state's very proud of this statute. In the 1970s, Minnesota passed this law, which provided, which is supposed to provide equal treatment and protection to American Indian cemeteries and burial grounds. Prior to this, a lot of these lake cabins, these resorts around the state, farmers, they had carte blanche to basically destroy a lot of the mound sites, and that's really a big problem. It's an ongoing problem still. When you look at some of the mound groups in Minneapolis and around the Mississippi River Valley. Now, MS 307.08 also allowed the state to repatriate ancestors who'd been previously excavated or those who may be disturbed. Also in the 80s, Museums and universities were encouraged to begin turning over human remains to the state to facilitate repatriation under state law. And many of these remains still remain unrepatriated. They haven't been given back due to not knowing what tribe they should go to. Some of these remains are considered ancient, and that is something that I think we need to get past as well. And then MIAC, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Commission, was also created to determine if burials can be removed, relocated, disturbed, or have any other protective measures removed. And MIAC is supposed to be prioritizing burial in place preservation. And what's great about MIAC is that every tribe in the state has a voice in MIAC, and MIAC meets on a regular basis to discuss issues of importance to tribes, THPOs, to tribal governments, and to discuss issues surrounding burials and the burial law. Let's go to the next slide. Can we go ahead, next slide? Yeah, there we go. Now, why is repatriation important? Repatriation is important to Native communities because it shows respect for the dead. It shows respect for cultural beliefs and practices, and it's a way of reconciliation for the damages that have been caused to Indigenous families and communities as a result of careless actions of colonial-based science and museum collection. And that, that is really key. You always see whenever meetings happen, people talk about reconciliation. Let's right past wrongs. Myself going into anthropology when I was first in school, I noticed back 30 years ago that a lot of the way that things were approached were bad. I went to the University of North Dakota for my undergraduate, and just recently they found a massive collection of human remains there. And I knew about that back when I was going to school as an undergrad, and I actually brought up the fact that I didn't agree with how they treated the remains at the university, and the professor in charge of osteology basically told me that he was never going to send me a recommendation for grad school because I didn't agree with the way he was doing things. And so I wasn't being a good anthropologist. But that is where we have to move past that colonial idea that science trumps culture, that museums are there to preserve. Now, it's about making it right and righting the wrongs of the past, showing respect to those who've been negatively impacted. Now, because of this, the collection of human remains and cultural items was always based on colonial wrongs. It doesn't matter if the museum says that they were well-intentioned, that they're trying to protect and preserve these items, these remains, because repatriation is essential to decolonization. Getting those cultural items back in the hands of people in those communities is how we decolonize. And there's no grounds upon which those holding remains or cultural items should ever have the right to refuse a request. But they try very hard. And that's what I wanted to talk about is my one biggest success in repatriation was something that took 10 years to come true. There was a water drum that was taken from the tribe back in the 1950s. A family owned the drum or held the drum on behalf of the tribe. They were the drum keepers. And during the 50s, people were very poor. There wasn't much money. And that was back when anthropologists really went through Indian country and did a lot of ethnographies, because even in the 1950s, they were worried that natives were going to disappear. And so this guy came through from the university. He was associated with the University of Chicago, I believe. And he met a family who were a drum keeper, and he brought them coffee, he brought them groceries, he talked to them, he recorded stories, he gave them money, he did all these very nice things for them. And then at the end, he said, that's a really great drum. Can I, take this back and study it and look at it and, I'll bring it back. He never did. He wrote in his journal, I bought this drum. In his mind, he gave the family all these, this money, these gifts, these groceries, all these things. And so, in his mind, he was buying it. In their mind, he stole it, and he did steal it. He stole something that belonged to the entire tribe that was in one family's possession. And when we finally, the family in the early 2000s, they came to me and they said, let's get this drum back. How can we do it? And I found out, what happened. And then I contacted the museum, and the museum just flat out said, no, he sold it. NAGPRA doesn't apply. I'm going, of course NAGPRA applies. And we had to build a case that this drum belonged to the tribe, that this family had no right, to dispose of it. So they couldn't sell it. And of course, the family was very, very worried that they were going to look bad because, they are, look like they sold a cultural item to this anthropologist. And it took a lot of soul searching from everybody to really figure out how we were going to do this. And it took 10 years to get this item back. The museum changed curators. The museum changed NAGPRA directors. They did a whole new inventory. It was a never-ending struggle. And we finally found one museum curator who had the, respect to finally, say, let's do this. And it took 10 years, and finally that drum is back in the hands of the family, back with the tribe, and a ceremony is done to wake that drum up and to bring it back to life. And repatriation shouldn't take 10 years. Elders can't wait 10 years to get these items back. Our communities have been waiting sometimes 100 years to get these items back. And so I think that that's something that we need to really impress upon federal agencies, museums, and everybody else is, these items have a rightful place and they belong with the communities they come from. And so we have to be our best advocates and really take control of how we approach cultural items, how we approach human remains, and have our ducks in a row, in a sense. Having the right people in place to care for these items when they come back, the right people who can repatriate and rebury and treat these remains when they come back in a good way, because those are the kind of things that they're going to ask at a museum. Do you have climate-controlled rooms for your items? Do you have, a burial location for your repatriated remains? What is your policy? And so it's a lot of work on behalf of the tribe, on behalf of the community, and on behalf of the individuals if an item is an item that is repatriatable to descendants. And so that was something that I thought was very noteworthy when it came to repatriation, is that I didn't expect it to take 10 years, but it took exactly 10 years. And that's pretty much it. I'd love to turn it over to Jaime or whoever, and let them give their perspective. I just want to thank you all for letting me talk, and I hope that I was able to give you some valuable information.
Thank you very much, Kade. Our next speaker is Jaime Arsenault. She's the current Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Repatriation Representative and Tribal Archivist for the White Earth Band of Minnesota Chippewa. Jaime has worked with Indigenous communities for over 25 years. Currently, she serves as the chairperson for the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History Repatriation Review Committee and is the co-chair for the Society of American Archivists Archival Repatriation Committee and is a member of the Minnesota Historical Society Indian Advisory Committee. So with that, we welcome Jaime to the discussion.
Hi there. I'm probably gonna have to turn my video off, so I don't mean any disrespect. I got moved to a room that's not very internet friendly, so I do apologize. But I'm gonna just try to do this so that I can make sure that I stay connected with you all. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So yeah, like Frankie mentioned, I've been doing repatriation for a little bit here, and I've been really blessed to be able to work with the tribes across the country and in Canada to assist them when they need somebody to go and do some of the repatriation work with them or help elders. And so for me, these are just, I guess, my own personal thoughts on doing this work for a little bit. And I often find that for museums, the record of an item begins with its accession into the museum, maybe the collector or the donor, that kind of thing. And for me, I really try to focus on the dispossession, what was going on in the community at the time this ancestor or this relative or this item was separated. And I try to make the museum aware of that, the institution aware of that. And that can be difficult because, as Kade was describing, a lot of times museums will talk about an item being a gift. And I would argue that there's almost no situation where that's going to be the case. At best, it would be a gift under duress. Similar to what you see with Holocaust survivors and how, their art or heirlooms from their family ended up, spread out across the world. It's a very similar kind of thing. And so that dispossession is, often an intentional act, right? It's aimed at disruption being a main goal. We've seen that in many communities, especially with the taking of sacred items, because, there were so many times where language and culture and just expression of being who you are was criminalized. And so ceremony being that last stronghold for language, makes sense to take that drum away. It makes sense to separate that pipe from the people. And in looking at a lot of archival documents, you can see, missionaries commenting on this, Indian agents commenting on this, that one of the key ways to get individuals to be separate was to remove those items. And then of course, with removal of human remains, there was that curiosity piece, that bounty piece, that idea that somehow we were disappearing. And so, I'm still here. Sorry, it froze for a minute. I had to wait. And so, as I've done this work, I've really been able to focus on how sacredness can take many forms. A song could be sacred. And so I really reject that narrow vision of what is eligible for repatriation, right? And I encourage communities to think, really broadly about what it is that they want to come home again. And don't ever be afraid to ask for that. Don't ever be afraid to make the case for that. I believe that tribes should be the ones to make those decisions for themselves, for what matters, what needs to come home. And part of that is really finding out what's out there, and that can be tricky. And so whenever I'm reaching out to an institution or an individual or an auction house, I'll always ask, what do you have that's connected to this community? This region, these are some of the town names. These are some last names. I make a search list, and I don't try to narrow it down to try to give somebody else this opportunity to decide what is sacred. So just asking the question in different ways can be helpful. And certainly working with communities, it's there's no escaping the reality that there are definitely some items like drums, for example, that are considered to be imbued with spirit, right? They're relatives, they need to be protected. That they need us and we need them, that there's responsibilities that are interrupted when there's that separation. And as Katie was saying, that burden of proof is often placed on the tribes from these institutions. And so there's a lot of time that gets spent in trying to get them to think differently, but I am seeing a shift. You have to kind of look at how it is that Indigenous items are treated versus, other also very significant items, and I like to think about just something as simple as shoes. When I would visit the Holocaust museums, those shoes are on display, but they're on display in collaboration with the community and with survivors who want the story told in a certain way, right? And so you have these ordinary items, these household items like shoes and a child's toy. They become imbued with a sort of sacredness because of the horrific things that happened. Same thing if you saw shoes from Sandy Hook or some other kind of tragedy. But tribes have to really struggle to try to explain that something from the grounds at Wounded Knee also has that same feeling to it. And so, I've seen those same types of, beaded moccasins, studied and looked at for the beautiful beadwork patterns or the region that they were from. But, communities really, unfairly so, can find themselves in these situations where they have to try to really explain the humanity and the respect that is due. But I am seeing a shift. And I will say that the repatriations that I have worked on, I've seen everybody that's involved with it has been transformed in some way. Things take a little longer than they should, but I do see a shift that happens. I think that there was this one moment that I had with Phil Deloria where he described why repatriation matters. He described it as a rebalancing. And I really thought that was a good way to describe it. Because everybody does become transformed. And many of these items do have a role within the community. And if culture is a healer, this becomes important to find those songs. It becomes important to bring those drums back. It becomes important to make the path right for ancestors who have been disrupted because of their burial spaces have been disturbed. Conversations within communities, sometimes there is I don't know how to describe it, but sometimes, there are individuals that will become worried about, can we care for these items? Can we do this as well as the museum? We don't have a state-of-the-art facility. We don't have, this exact setup that the Smithsonian has. Maybe we can't do this. And for me, what I've been doing for the past couple of decades is I take pictures of all those times in museums where things kind of fall short. I know that the Smithsonian's roof has a leaking problem. I know that, I can list off the names of museums that have pest problems. I know that, there's all these different kinds of situations. I've seen sacred items stored in beer boxes, at really well-known institutions. So this idea that, as if a tribe doesn't have the state-of-the-art facility, then they might not be able to do it well. I really want to encourage people in communities to know that you can do it. Everybody that's doing this work, your ancestors are so ingenious, just so amazing and just creative. And there's always a way to bring home what needs to come home, even if you don't have that facility. And these other institutions are not nearly as perfect as they appear on the outside. So, there's that. The same thing can be said for burial locations. Do you have a space that meets certain needs? And I've seen communities become so creative. In California, for example, there were communities that wanted to repatriate individuals to mounds. They wanted to create new mounds, and they were facing a looting problem because they were really close to an urban center. And they came up with these, they were like cylinder concrete kind of slabs. They were like almost like a toilet paper roll, if you imagine it on its side, right? And it's concrete, and there's all these circles all carved throughout it, so that when the ancestors are put inside it, they're still touching the earth. But then they would use this almost like a piece of heavy machinery to place a cement cover on top, and then they would put the dirt over there so that they could pull it off and they could add individuals, but nobody could dig and nobody could remove those individuals, and their ancestors could still touch the earth. So they came up with this. And I've seen just so many wonderful examples of a community saying, we're gonna find a way, and they do. Other things that communities can do is they can have what's called a shared stewardship agreement with an institution. So if you can't bring, something or a relative home right away, you can make the decisions on how they're cared for, what direction they face, who has access to them, that kind of thing, until such a time when you can bring them back. The other thing that I created a document with Jane Anderson, and she's an intellectual property rights attorney, and she's done a lot of work with Indigenous communities, in Australia and all throughout the States and all around the world. And we called it a future acquisitions agreement, and we set that up with different institutions so that in the future, if an institution is ever offered an item or any kind of materials from your community, they have to contact you. And you would have right of first refusal, or at least be notified that an item or any kind of information has surfaced. And that could also include institutions that all of a sudden find stuff within their collections, which always happens. This way the burden isn't on you to continuously reach out and keep track of these individuals. And, I just had some success with that recently, where the Smithsonian was approached by somebody who, again, had acquired a lot of beaded outfits from, White Earth, and they were gonna offer to the Smithsonian, and they said, well, wait, let's check in with the tribe. Do they want these items? And so it's just something simple like that. It doesn't cost any money, but it can open up a whole new way of working together. The other thing that's really helpful to know is that any institution that received any kind of COVID funding is now bound by NAGPRA and other repatriation regulation, right? So, those who may have dismissed a community in the past and said, well, we don't receive funds, so, we don't have to do this. If they accepted any kind of assistance during this pandemic, they have to do this. I think I've probably spoken for more than my 15 minutes. I'm not sure if I have, though. If I haven't, I have one more thing that I can add. I'm guessing I'm okay. Okay. So I can give one example of a repatriation going really well. But over a period of years and in an unexpected way. And so back in 2017, I repatriated a birch bark scroll along with the typo at the time for White Earth, Kayla Olson. And so the scroll was about 8 feet long, and it came from the Peabody Institute in Andover, Massachusetts, not the Harvard Peabody. And so in the process of that repatriation, we had asked, do you have anything else? Is there anything else? Can you list everything connected to White Earth? And so they did. And among what they provided were a few hundred images taken during the time that the item was dispossessed from the people. And so these images were taken in 1910, and they showed, families basically becoming homeless and being living in tents, and they showed sickness. They showed just how hard the conditions were. And I was able to use those photographs in a future repatriation when I was trying to bring a big drum back to the people that was taken from missionaries who were trying to separate community members. And the museum at that time said, well, how do we know it wasn't a gift? What was really going on at the time? And so a picture can say 1,000 words, right? So we sat and we talked and we looked at some of these things together. And immediately they said, yeah, this has to come home. And so I started working with a group to produce something called NAGPRA Comics. So they were going to do a comic issue of kind of this repatriation and the drum repatriation, because they wanted to put it in comic book form so that it's more accessible for young people and schools and that kind of thing. And so in the process of working with NAGPRA Comics, the individual who had taken the scroll in 1910, his documentation ended up being sent to Ohio, so the Ohio History Connection. So they found out about it, the comic book, and they turned over a few thousand pages worth of documentation and affidavits from these families that were being forced off, out of their own homes and having their allotments taken. And so the repatriation of this one scroll ended up leading to the repatriation of this drum, which ended up leading to, thousands of pages of documentation and maps and things like that to the people. So, all of these things are connected, and, it's just really helpful to think as broadly as you can, and never, don't ever assume that you can't do this or you don't have all the materials in place. There's always a way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaime. Personally, I have a repatriation story with everybody who spoke. Over 10 years ago, Honor and I helped stop the sale of 6 Lakota scalp locks that were on the auction block in Germany, and we helped return those. 4 years ago, or almost 5 years ago now, Noah, when we brought Chief White Dog's pipe back, it was Jaime who wrote the policy with TSA at the airport that helps us be able to transport sacred objects through security at a much expedited process, and one that is really cultural sensitive. So these people have played a large part in repatriation on a national level. Kade has always been my go-to archaeologist. As one of the few Native Americans who possesses a master's degree or higher, whenever I need an archaeological report done or a survey done or advice on things in that nature, Kade has always made himself available to us. And so with that, I want to bring our next guest up, and somebody that I enjoy working with as somebody who's getting to be one of the older cats in the room. It's been a real treat to watch Samantha find her voice in this line of work and represent not only her community, but the Dakota Oyate in a very honorable way. And so our next speaker who joins us here in person is Samantha Odegard. She is from the Upper Sioux Indian community, and she's the current Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and the NAGPRA representative for her community. And at this time, I'll bring Samantha up to talk about repatriation components.
Hamadakabi, Waduta Yohaya Gawe de me, Pajuta Zizi Kapi, Hemataha, Damakota, Chankude Hemacha. I want to say that, I'm honored to be here, to be asked to be part of this. Like Frankie said, I look at myself as one of the newer ones, although a lot happens in 5 years as a TIPO, and it was very much a crash course. I kind of look at myself more as like the third generation of people doing this work. You have the ones that I'm currently working with, that I'm still learning from, and then the OGs from back when they were still creating a lot, and I've had the opportunity to learn from them as well. So, like I said, to know that I'm getting to not only work with those people, but seeing things that they've taught me be put into use. So I feel like I am in many ways just starting this journey, especially when it comes to repatriation. So I don't have as many success stories or anything like that, but one of the things that Frankie, when he gave me my little, here's the things to talk about, was, why is repatriation important to my community? And I was thinking, how do I answer that? Well, that's all these different reasons, but honestly, Frankie, that's a tough question. Because it's like saying, why are your relatives important to your community? They just are. And for me, with repatriation work, whether it's our actual relatives or it's the spiritual items that they're connected to, is that's what they are. They're people, they're relatives. That it's not about us, it's about them. And they've been violated in so many different ways. They've been literally held prisoner for decades in boxes. And as you start to do this work, and when you try to keep that focus, you start to make those connections. And when you're around our ancestors or relatives who visit these places, you can still feel what they're feeling. You can feel that anger, that fear, that sadness that they're feeling because they are where they are. So that's why it's important to me and the people that I work with back home. And I didn't jump right in, when I started with TIPO, I didn't jump right into NAGPRA work. Mainly one of the biggest reasons is, there were attempts made with the previous TIPO that faced roadblocks, that were denied, that sometimes was even having to butt heads with other Indigenous people, and it made me stop. I froze because I didn't want to do that. I refused to jump through those hoops that Jaime and Kade were talking about, because I'm why? Who is this institution who has committed centuries of atrocities against our people? Who are they to tell me that and ask me if I know how to care for my relatives? Like, I'm not gonna justify that and explain it to them, or who are they to tell me how I'm connected to them or what's important to us? So I took a step back from that and I focused on other typical things. Because I wanted to center myself and look at it differently. Because like I said, I don't want to jump through those. I want to try to make another path. And I'm not knocking the ones that do, and I'm sure there are times that I've kind of followed the rules a little bit, but because I feel that it's by any means necessary. But I also know that that's just a personal stance that I want to take, is that they have to prove to me that they are trying to do the right thing, that they're better than the people that came before them. So I held off. But by doing that, that leads into the success stories, or whatever you want to call them, that I've had. That just happened actually this summer. I think a lot of you probably have heard about the skull fragment that was found in Renville County along the Minnesota River. That Renville County actually got a lot of the flack for violating NYCRA, but actually it was the FBI when they went ahead and tested the carbon dated this skull fragment, because that's against the law. They did it without consulting with tribes. So back to the point of who are these? Like, hello, the FBI just broke the law. And so, although I didn't feel I was ready to start taking on those roles of being the one to go after remains and do repatriation, when that happened and when it was so close to home, it just fell into place. I know a lot of other people, Dylan, the other TIPOs, OSA, and there was a lot of public outcry. So we were able to get that individual back. We were able to care for them and bury them in a respectful way, and hopefully they will never be disturbed again. But the result of that was later on that same summer when more remains were found along the Minnesota River, this time even closer to home, is that the Yale Medicine County Sheriff, my county where I live in, they had heard about that. They didn't want to repeat. They didn't want to have anything to do with that or the turmoil that came with it. So they called us right away and told us what had happened. We did bring in the osteologist to do a check, but they turned that relative over as soon as we confirmed that it was a Native person older than before colonization or contact. So we were able to prevent it going into the system, prevent any kind of NYCRA violation, because it was a natural process that revealed the burial. So to me, those are my repatriation success stories. And I could probably go on for a while yet, but I'm actually going to wrap it up real quick and we can have a break. And I look forward to more discussion with you guys in a bit.
Before we move into the next round of discussion, we're going to take just a quick 5 or 10 minute break. So.